After more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned something that never stops surprising me. Court is rarely about the charge written on the paper. Most of the time, it's about what people are carrying when they walk through those doors. Fear, shame, regret, and sometimes pain so heavy it barely fits inside a human body. That morning started like so many others, quiet, predictable, almost comforting in its routine. I woke up before the sun, sat at my kitchen table, and poured myself a cup of strong black coffee. No sugar, no cream. I've had it that way for decades. Those few quiet minutes before the world wakes up are when I gather myself, because once court begins, people bring their lives with them. By 8:15, I was walking into the courthouse, nodding to the familiar faces, hearing the echo of footsteps against the marble floors. The building has a sound all its own, papers shuffling, low voices, doors opening and closing. After all these years, that rhythm feels like second nature to me. In my chambers, Christina already had the files laid out neatly on my desk. She knows my routine better than anyone. We've worked together long enough that she can read my mood before I say a word. She handed me my coffee and smiled, and I thanked her like I always do. I glanced over the docket, traffic matters, missed appearances, minor violations. Nothing on paper that stood out, and I've learned never to trust paper. Paper doesn't tell you who cried in their car before walking inside. Paper doesn't tell you who didn't sleep the night before. Paper doesn't tell you who just lost everything. When I took my seat on the bench and looked out over my courtroom, I did what I always do. I looked at people first, faces, posture, eyes. You can tell a lot before anyone ever speaks. The morning moved along steadily, one case after another. Some people frustrated, some defensive, some apologetic. I listened, I asked questions, I ruled, routine, order, structure, the law doing what it's meant to do. But even in routine, I've learned to stay alert, because sometimes a life-altering moment walks in quietly without warning. As Christina called the next name, I looked up casually at first, and then I really looked. A woman stood up slowly from the bench, not quickly, not confidently. Slowly, like her body was following instructions, her mind was giving one step at a time. She adjusted her coat, even though the room wasn't cold. She looked down for a moment before walking forward, as if she needed to gather herself. I watched her make her way toward the podium, and something about her stopped me. She wasn't crying, she wasn't visibly upset, but there was a stillness about her that felt heavy. Her clothes were simple, wrinkled like they had been slept in. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, not styled, not hidden. Her face looked pale, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. She walked alone, no friend rising beside her, no family member whispering encouragement, just her. When she reached the podium, she placed her hands on it gently, almost delicately, like she wasn't sure she had the strength to lean. She kept her eyes lowered for a moment, then lifted them to meet mine. And when she did, I felt it in my chest. Her eyes were empty and full at the same time. I asked her to state her name. Her voice was soft, steady, but distant, like it was coming from far away. She said it politely, respectfully, as if manners were something she could still control. I explained why she was there, a minor matter, something that, on any other day, might have taken 2 minutes to resolve. As I spoke, I watched her closely. She nodded at the right moments, but I could tell she wasn't fully present. Her mind was somewhere else. I asked her if she understood the charge. She nodded again. I asked her if she wanted to explain what happened, and that's when I noticed her hands. They were shaking, not dramatically, just slightly, the kind of shaking you only notice if you're paying attention, the kind that comes when someone has been holding themselves together for too long. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped, took a breath, then another. The room felt quieter than it had a moment before. I waited. I've learned that silence can be kinder than interruption. She looked down at the podium, then back up at me. Her lips trembled just for a second, and then she spoke. Not yet with the words that would break the room open, but with hesitation, with effort, with a voice that sounded like it was pushing through something heavy. She apologized for being there. That caught my attention immediately. I told her she didn't need to apologize. Court isn't something you apologize for attending. But she nodded anyway, like apologizing had become a reflex. I asked her a simple question. I asked if everything was all right. She stared at me for a moment, like she wasn't sure how to answer that, like the question itself didn't fit the world she was living in anymore. The courtroom was still. Even the people waiting for their own cases seemed to sense that something was happening. She swallowed hard, and then she said she was trying her best to focus. That sentence alone told me this wasn't a normal day for her. I leaned forward slightly, removed my glasses, and set them on the bench. I do that when I want someone to know I'm speaking to them as a person, not just as a judge. I told her to take her time. She nodded again, took another breath, and for a brief moment I saw her composure crack. Just a hairline fracture, enough to let me know something was holding her together by will alone. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to hear a sentence that would stay with me for the rest of my career. Before she spoke again, I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place carrying pain so heavy no one could see it? A place where the world expected you to function, even though your life had just been torn apart? If you have, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure you are, because this story is only beginning. And what happened next changed me in ways I didn't expect. I waited for her to speak, and when she did, everything changed. I watched her closely as she stood there in silence. Silence in a courtroom can feel uncomfortable, but this wasn't that kind of silence. This was the kind that asks for patience, the kind that says, "Don't rush me, I'm barely holding on." She finally spoke, but not with the sentence that would soon change everything. Not yet. She explained the case in front of her. A missed appearance, a minor issue, something that on paper felt routine. As she spoke, her words were careful, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced them in her head to make sure she didn't forget. That told me her mind was fighting through fog. I asked her what caused her to miss the date. She hesitated again. I've learned over the years that hesitation usually means one of two things. Either someone is hiding something, or someone is trying to find the strength to tell the truth. This felt like the second. Her shoulders lifted slightly as she took another breath. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. Her eyes glistened now, but she still wasn't crying. Not yet. Shock has a way of delaying tears. She said she hadn't meant to miss court. She said she knew it was important. She said she wasn't making excuses. That word again. Excuses. I gently stopped her. I told her I wasn't there to trap her in words. I told her I just wanted to understand what happened. She nodded, grateful for that small kindness. She explained that the last few days had been confusing. That time didn't feel real. That she kept forgetting what day it was, what she was supposed to do, where she was supposed to be. As she spoke, her voice cracked just slightly. She paused, closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. That was the first moment I felt my chest tighten. I asked her if something significant had happened recently. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the courtroom, not in fear, almost in disbelief, like she couldn't understand how the world was still moving normally when hers had stopped. She looked back at me, and her lips parted like she was about to speak, but nothing came out. I waited. Everyone else waited too. Christina sat still. The gallery was silent. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the air felt heavy. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she hadn't slept much. She said she hadn't eaten properly. She said she felt like she was moving through water. I asked her if she needed to sit down. She shook her head slowly. Pride can be stubborn, even in grief. She told me she just needed to say it out loud. That sentence alone told me what was coming. She took one more breath, a deep one this time, the kind you take before stepping off a ledge, hoping there's something solid on the other side, and then she said it. She said, "Your Honor, I buried my husband yesterday." For a moment I didn't hear anything else. The words landed in the room like a weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just final, heavy, unavoidable. I felt it in my chest first, a tightening, like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart. I've heard a lot of things in this courtroom over the years, confessions, excuses, anger, regret. But that sentence doesn't come often. I looked at her, really looked at her now, and suddenly everything made sense. The emptiness in her eyes, the shaking hands, the distant voice. She wasn't distracted. She was shattered. The courtroom was completely silent. I've seen silence before, but this was different. This was respect. This was shock. This was every person in that room realizing they were witnessing someone standing up on the worst day of their life. She continued speaking slowly, like each word had to be pulled out of her. She said the funeral had been the day before. She said everything after that felt unreal. She said she didn't even remember the court date until that morning. And when she realized it, she came anyway. That detail stayed with me. She came anyway. She said she didn't know why she felt compelled to be there. She said she almost stayed home, almost stayed in bed, almost ignored everything else in the world. But she said her husband wouldn't have wanted that. She said he always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I felt my throat tighten. I thought about my own wife. I thought about what it would feel like to bury the person who has walked beside you through life and then have to stand in a courtroom the next day explaining a missed date. The thought alone was overwhelming. I realized then that this wasn't about a case. This was about grief colliding with responsibility. She wasn't asking for mercy. She wasn't begging. She was explaining almost apologetically why she hadn't been able to function like the world expected her to. She kept her composure as she spoke, but I could see it slipping. Her voice trembled now. Her hands were shaking more visibly. Tears welled up, but she still didn't let them fall. I admired her strength in that moment, and I hated that she needed it. I took a breath of my own. I had to steady myself before speaking. I told her I was very sorry for her loss. Those words felt small compared to the weight she was carrying, but they were the only honest ones I had in that moment. She nodded, eyes locked on the podium, as if looking at me might make everything spill over. I asked her how long she and her husband had been married. She said 32 years, 32 years. I felt my chest tighten again. That's not just a marriage, that's a lifetime. That's shared memories, habits, inside jokes, arguments, forgiveness, mornings, nights, and everything in between. I asked her his name. She said it softly, like saying it too loudly might hurt. She told me he had been sick for a while, that they had been preparing in a way, but that nothing prepares you for the final moment. She said she held his hand when he passed. That was it. I had to pause. I felt my eyes burn. I looked down at the papers in front of me, not because they mattered anymore, but because I needed a second to compose myself. I'm a judge. I wear a robe. People expect me to be composed, controlled, professional, but I'm also human, and in that moment, being human came first. Before I continue, let me pause here. If that sentence hits you the way it hit me, take a second and leave a comment with a heart. And if you're still with me, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next is something I will never forget for as long as I live. I looked back up at her, and I realized this case was about to become something much bigger than the law. I looked at her for a long moment after she said those words. 32 years. That number stayed with me. You don't just lose a spouse after 32 years. You lose a rhythm, a witness to your life, a future you thought was already written. The courtroom was still frozen in silence. No one shifted in their seat. No one cleared their throat. Even the air felt heavier. I've seen moments like that before. but they never get easier. Grief has a way of commanding respect without asking for it. I took a slow breath and reminded myself to speak carefully. Words matter most when someone is standing at the edge of themselves. I told her again how sorry I was, not as a formality, as a person. I told her there was no timetable for grief and no rule book for how someone is supposed to function the day after a loss like that. She nodded slightly, still looking down. When she lifted her eyes again, I could see they were glassy now. The shock was wearing off and the pain was trying to surface. I asked her how she was holding up. She gave a small, sad smile. The kind of smile people give when the honest answer is too heavy to say out loud. She said she didn't really know. She said everything felt distant, like she was watching her life happen from far away. That description told me exactly where she was. Grief does that. It pulls you out of your own body and makes the world feel unreal. I asked her if she had anyone with her, family, friends, anyone helping her through this. She shook her head slowly. She said her children lived out of state. They had come for the funeral, but they had gone back the night before. Work, kids, life continuing, even when yours has stopped. She said she insisted they go. She didn't want to be the reason they put everything on hold. That sentence hit me hard. Even in her grief, she was still thinking about everyone else. I asked her how she had managed the last 24 hours. She took a breath and said she honestly couldn't remember most of it. She said she woke up that morning, realized she had missed the court date, and panicked. She said she didn't even consider calling. She just got dressed and came. She said something then that stayed with me. She said she didn't want to feel like she was failing at everything. That's what grief does. It makes ordinary responsibilities feel like moral tests you're constantly failing. I leaned forward slightly and rested my hands on the bench. I wanted her to hear this clearly. I told her that missing a court date under these circumstances was not a failure. I told her that showing up at all the day after burying her husband was an act of strength, whether she realized it or not. Her lips trembled. She swallowed hard. I could see tears pooling now, finally breaking through the wall she had built. I asked her if she had driven herself there. She nodded. I asked her if she felt safe driving. She paused, then admitted she probably shouldn't have, but she didn't know what else to do. She said sitting at home felt unbearable. She said moving felt easier than being still. That honesty mattered. I told her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do after a loss is admit you're not okay. I told her that nothing about what she was experiencing was wrong or unusual. It was human. I could feel my own voice tightening slightly. I kept it steady, but it took effort. I've seen many cases over the years. I've comforted people, but every so often one breaks through the armor. This was one of those moments. I thought about my own marriage. I thought about the quiet routines you build with someone over decades, the way their presence becomes part of the room even when they're not speaking. The idea of that suddenly being gone felt unbearable. I noticed her hands again. They were gripping the edge of the podium now, knuckles pale. She was holding on with everything she had left. I told her she could sit if she needed to. This time, she didn't refuse. She nodded and slowly lowered herself into the chair beside the podium. As soon as she sat, her shoulders sagged, like she had finally allowed herself to feel how tired she was. I let her sit there for a moment without speaking. The law can wait. Grief cannot. When I spoke again, I asked her about her husband. I didn't ask out of curiosity. I asked because sometimes saying their name, saying who they were, keeps them present for a moment longer. Her face softened immediately. The pain was still there, but now it was mixed with love. She told me he was kind. She said he had a quiet sense of humor. She said he always made sure the doors were locked at night and the coffee was ready in the morning. Small details, the kind that matter most. She smiled briefly as she spoke about him, and then the smile faded. Tears finally spilled over, silently at first. She didn't sob. She just cried, the way people do when they've been holding it in for too long. I felt my own eyes burn. I removed my glasses again and set them carefully on the bench. I stared down for a second, pretending to review the file, but really just trying to compose myself. This is the part people don't see on television. Judges are expected to be steady, impartial, unmoved, but we don't stop being human when we put on a robe. We just learn how to carry it quietly. I took a breath and looked back up at her. I told her something I meant deeply. I told her she did not owe the court anything that day. Not explanations, not apologies, not strength. She looked at me surprised. I told her that grief doesn't run on schedules. It doesn't care about dates or deadlines. And I told her that the law exists to serve people, not to punish them for being human. Her tears came harder then. She covered her mouth, trying to keep control. I let her have the moment. No rush, no interruption. The courtroom stayed silent, honoring her pain without a word. At that point, I knew exactly what I was going to do, but before I could say it, I needed to say something else. I told her that her husband would be proud of her for showing up. I told her that the fact she came at all on a day like that spoke volumes about her character. She nodded, crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. I could feel my own composure slipping. My voice wavered slightly, and I had to pause again. I took a deep breath, counted silently, and steadied myself. Let me pause here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever had to show up somewhere when you had no business being strong, when the world expected you to function even though your heart was breaking? If you know that feeling, tell me in the comments. And if you're still with me, hit that like button, because what happened next was the moment I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I looked at her again, and in that moment the law took a back seat to compassion. I sat there for a moment longer than usual, letting the silence do what words couldn't. The law gives judges authority, but moments like this remind me that authority means nothing if it's not tempered with humanity. I could feel the weight of the room pressing inward, every person present holding their breath with her. I looked at her sitting there, shoulders slumped now, hands resting loosely in her lap. The strength she had used to walk into the courtroom was finally running out. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She was just surviving minute by minute. I spoke softly, careful not to startle her out of that fragile space. I told her she didn't need to rush. I told her she could take all the time she needed. I said it slowly, because grief hears things better when they're gentle. She nodded, eyes red, cheeks damp. She apologized again, almost automatically, for crying. That apology cut deeper than the tears themselves. I told her something firmly but kindly. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. I told her tears were not a disruption. They were a response, a human one. She looked up at me then, really looked at me, like she was trying to decide if she believed me. I leaned forward slightly and rested my hands on the bench. I wanted her to know I was fully present. I asked her how she was planning to get through the next few days, not because it affected the case, but because it affected her. She hesitated, then admitted she hadn't thought that far ahead. She said everything after the funeral felt like walking into a blank wall. No plan, no direction, just quiet. I nodded. I told her that was normal. I told her that after a loss like hers, thinking beyond the next hour can feel impossible. I told her not to pressure herself to have answers she didn't need yet. As I spoke, I felt my voice tighten again. I could hear it. I could feel it. I slowed my speech deliberately, grounding myself in the moment. I noticed something else then. Her hands were still shaking slightly. She had stopped wiping her tears, like she didn't have the energy anymore. That told me she was reaching her limit. I asked Christina quietly to bring her a glass of water. Christina moved immediately, carefully, respectfully, as if she understood this moment didn't belong to the court. It belonged to the person. As the water was placed in front of her, she looked surprised, then grateful. She took a small sip, her hands trembling, and whispered, "Thank you." That whisper hit me harder than anything else so far. I thought about all the times people are expected to be composed in public, no matter what they're going through. I thought about how grief doesn't care about decorum or schedules or expectations. I asked her another question, one that had nothing to do with the charge. I asked her how she and her husband met. Her expression changed instantly. Pain was still there, but something warmer surfaced too. She told me they met when they were young. She laughed softly through tears and said he was late to their first date and spent the rest of their marriage making jokes about it. The courtroom felt different now, lighter and heavier at the same time. Love does that. It fills the space even when the person is gone. She told me he used to remind her about appointments, court dates, bills, little things she never had to worry about because he handled them. She said missing the court date felt like failing him. That broke my heart. I told her she hadn't failed him. I told her that love doesn't disappear because you miss a date or forget a responsibility. I told her that love shows up in moments like this when you still try to do the right thing even when you're shattered. She cried openly now, no longer holding back, and I felt my own eyes fill again. I removed my glasses slowly and set them down. I stared at the wood grain of the bench for a moment, steadying myself. I've done this job a long time, but that doesn't make you immune to moments like this. It just teaches you how to breathe through them. I took a breath and looked back up at her. I told her something I rarely say out loud in court. I told her that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit they can't carry everything alone. I told her she didn't have to be strong in my courtroom. That was it. I felt my eyes burn, and this time I couldn't stop it. Tears welled up, and I had to pause again. I pressed my lips together, took a slow breath, and let the moment pass without pretending it wasn't happening. The courtroom was completely silent. No one looked away. No one shifted. No one judged. I felt exposed for a second. Judges aren't supposed to show emotion, but in that moment, hiding it would have felt dishonest. I looked at her and said quietly that I was human before I was a judge. I said it simply, without apology, and I meant it. She looked back at me, tears streaming, and nodded. Something passed between us then, not pity, not authority, understanding. I told her she should not have been in court that day. I told her she should have been home, grieving, surrounded by whatever comfort she could find. I told her the fact that she came anyway said everything I needed to know about her character. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. I let her cry. That's something people don't realize about justice. Sometimes justice is knowing when to stop talking. When she finally looked up again, her face was blotchy, her eyes swollen, but there was something else there too, relief, like she had finally been allowed to exhale. I took another breath, steady this time. I knew exactly what I was going to do, but before I did, I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone break down and felt your own walls crack with them? Have you ever realized that compassion isn't weakness, but courage? If this moment is resonating with you, hit that like button, and if you believe moments like this matter, subscribe to this channel. Because what came next was not just a ruling, it was a statement about what justice really means. I looked back at her, and I prepared to say the words that would change the rest of her day. I could feel my heart beating harder than usual as I sat there looking at her. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved in closer to hold what was happening inside. I've learned over the years that when a room goes that quiet, something important is taking place. Not legally important, humanly important. I reached for my glasses again, then stopped myself. I left them on the bench where they were. I didn't need them to see what was in front of me. I told her, gently but clearly, that I was going to take care of this matter right now. I didn't want her to sit there wondering what would happen next. Uncertainty is cruel, especially when someone is already drowning in grief. She looked up at me, eyes red and swollen, fear flickering across her face for just a second. Even in that moment, she was bracing herself. That told me she'd been strong for a long time. I told her the case was dismissed. Just like that, no conditions, no warnings, no lectures, no paperwork she needed to worry about later. I told her there would be no fine, no further action, and no consequences for missing the date. For a moment, she didn't react at all. I've seen that look before. It's the look people get when relief arrives somewhere they weren't expecting it, when their mind hasn't caught up to what their ears just heard. She blinked a few times, like she was trying to make sure she understood me correctly. Then her shoulders dropped and the tears came again, this time mixed with something else, relief. She shook her head slowly, almost in disbelief, and whispered, "Thank you." But it didn't sound like a normal thank you. It sounded like someone who had been holding their breath for days finally letting it out. I raised my hand slightly and stopped her from saying more. I told her she didn't need to thank me. I told her this was not mercy, this was common sense, and more importantly, it was compassion. I told her that the law does not exist to punish people for being human. I told her that no one should have to explain their grief to earn understanding. And I told her that she had already done more than enough just by walking into that room. My voice cracked slightly as I said it. I could hear it myself. I didn't try to hide it. I felt tears spill over again, and this time I didn't fight them. I pressed my lips together and took a slow breath, letting the emotion pass through instead of pushing it down. After 4 decades on this bench, I've learned that pretending you don't feel anything doesn't make you strong. It just makes you distant. The courtroom stayed silent. I looked at her and said something I don't often say in court. I told her to go home. I told her to take care of herself. I told her to grieve in whatever way she needed to, without worrying about court dates or paperwork or explanations. I told her that some days are not meant for responsibility. They are meant for survival. She nodded again, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she placed one hand over her heart, like that was the only way she could respond. I felt my chest tighten again. I told her one more thing before letting her go. I told her that the love she shared with her husband didn't end at the funeral. I told her that love doesn't disappear. It changes shape, but it stays with you. And I told her that she didn't have to carry that weight alone in places like this. She stood slowly, legs unsteady. A court officer moved closer instinctively, not to escort her, but to support her if she needed it. That small gesture mattered. As she turned to leave, she paused for a second and looked back at me. Our eyes met. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already passed between us. I watched her walk toward the exit, step by careful step. She looked exhausted, broken, but she also looked lighter than when she had walked in. When the door closed behind her, the room remained quiet. I sat there for a moment longer than usual. I didn't rush to call the next case. I needed a second to collect myself. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and reminded myself where I was. This job requires balance. You carry other people's pain, but you can't let it stop the world entirely. Still, moments like that stay with you, whether you want them to or not. I looked out at the people waiting for their cases. I could see it on their faces. They had felt it too. A reminder that this courtroom is not just a place for rules, but for people. I cleared my throat gently and nodded to Christina to continue. Court moved on. It always does. But something had shifted. As the next case began, I found myself listening more closely, speaking more gently, pausing more often. That woman had changed the temperature of the room without even trying. Later that day, during a brief recess, Christina leaned over and said quietly that she had never seen the courtroom that still. I nodded. I told her some moments demand silence. When court finally ended that afternoon, I returned to my chambers and closed the door behind me. I sat down and let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I thought about how small the charge had been, how insignificant it felt compared to the weight of what she was carrying. I thought about how easily the system could have added to her pain instead of easing it. And I thought about how close I had come to losing my composure completely. I don't regret the tears. They were honest. They were human. And they reminded everyone in that room that authority does not mean distance. Before I continue this story, let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a moment where compassion mattered more than rules? Where doing the right thing meant stepping outside routine? If that resonates with you, leave a comment and tell me what you think. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit that subscribe button and that like button. Because what happened after court that day is something I still think about often. The case was dismissed, but the impact of that moment was just beginning. After the courtroom emptied that afternoon, I stayed seated on the bench longer than usual. The room felt different now, quieter, even though it was empty. Moments like that don't fade when the door closes. They linger, they sit with you, they follow you back to your chambers, whether you invite them or not. I gathered my papers slowly and stood up. My legs felt heavier than they had that morning, not from age, from emotion. I walked back to my chambers, closed the door behind me, and finally allowed myself to sit without posture, without performance, without the weight of expectation. I thought about her again, about how she walked in carrying a grief so fresh it hadn't even found its shape yet, about how she stood there apologizing for existing in pain, and about how easily the law could have missed that if I hadn't slowed down. That's something people don't realize. Justice doesn't fail because people are cruel. It fails because people are rushed. I poured myself a glass of water and sat quietly, staring at the wall for a moment. My wife always tells me she can tell when a day has followed me home before I even say a word. That day, I already knew she would see it in my eyes. As I sat there, I thought about how many widows and widowers I've seen in this courtroom over the years, each one carrying grief differently, some angry, some numb, some lost. But all of them changed forever by a moment they never asked for. Grief doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check schedules, and it certainly doesn't care about court dates. I realized something important in that quiet moment. That woman didn't just show up to court the day after burying her husband. She showed up because she was still trying to honor the life they built together. She came because responsibility still mattered to her, even when her world had collapsed. That kind of character deserves protection, not punishment. Later that evening, when I got home, my wife noticed immediately that I was quieter than usual. I kissed her hello, set my coat down, and sat at the kitchen table. She poured me coffee without asking. After all these years, she knows. I told her about the woman. I told her about the sentence that stopped the room cold. I told her how my voice cracked and how I couldn't hold back the tears. I told her how small the case was and how enormous the grief was. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer advice. She just held my hand and said something simple. She said grief doesn't follow rules, and neither should compassion. She was right. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because I was upset, but because my mind kept returning to that courtroom, to the way she looked standing there, to the way her shoulders finally dropped when I dismissed the case, to the way relief and sorrow can exist in the same breath. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse at the same time I always do, 8:15 on the dot. Christina greeted me with her usual warmth, but she also gave me a knowing look. She had been there. She had felt it too. Court began as usual, different faces, different cases, different stories. But something in me had shifted. I found myself slowing down even more, listening longer, pausing before responding, letting silence do some of the work. A man stood before me that morning, frustrated and impatient. Instead of reacting, I asked him what was really going on. He sighed, then admitted his mother had passed away 2 weeks earlier, and he hadn't been himself since. Just like that, the tone changed. That's the thing about compassion. Once you let it in, it shows up everywhere. During a short break, Christina told me that the woman from the previous day had called the clerk's office, not to ask about the case, not to complain, just to say thank you. She didn't leave a long message. She simply said she wanted us to know she made it home safely. That detail stayed with me. She made it home safely. Grief makes even small things feel uncertain. Getting home can feel like an accomplishment when your world has been turned upside down. I nodded and asked Christina to let her know there was nothing more she needed to worry about, that her case was closed completely. Christina smiled softly and said she would. The days passed and court continued, but every now and then I would catch myself thinking about her, wondering how she was doing, wondering how quiet her house must feel now, wondering how many times she reached for her phone to tell him something before remembering. Grief lives in those moments. A few weeks later, I received a letter. It was handwritten. The envelope was plain, no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was hers. I sat down before opening it. She wrote that she wasn't sure if it was appropriate to write, but she felt compelled to. She wrote that the days since the funeral had been heavy and confusing, that sometimes she felt strong and other times she couldn't get out of bed. She wrote that standing in my courtroom the day after burying her husband had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. But she also wrote that being treated with kindness instead of judgment had helped her feel less alone in a moment when loneliness felt overwhelming. She said something that stayed with me deeply. She wrote that for a few minutes that day, she felt seen as a person, not as a problem. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer where I keep things that matter. Not legal documents, reminders. Reminders of why this job is more than rules and robes. I thought about how close I came to missing that moment, how easy it would have been to rush, to focus on procedure, to move on to the next case without truly listening. That thought unsettled me. As weeks passed, I didn't hear from her again, and that was okay. That usually means someone is doing the quiet work of healing, or at least surviving. But her story stayed with me. It stayed with me every time someone stood before me looking overwhelmed, every time someone apologized for being human, every time someone thought the law would add to their pain instead of easing it. I realized something important. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do is recognize when the law has already taken enough. Before we move into the final part of this story, let me ask you something honestly. Do you believe there are moments when compassion should outweigh procedure? When being human matters more than being right? Tell me what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, make sure you're subscribed, because the final part of this story carries a lesson I've held on to ever since. Because what happened after that letter reminded me why I still believe in justice after all these years. The final part of this story didn't happen in my courtroom. It didn't happen under the lights or behind the bench. It happened quietly, the way healing often does, long after the moment everyone else remembers. It happened weeks later. One afternoon, after court had ended and the building had mostly emptied, I was sitting alone in my chambers. I had taken off my robe and folded it carefully, the same way I always do. That simple ritual helps me leave the day behind, but that day, something lingered. Christina knocked softly and stepped inside. She held an envelope in her hand and said it had been dropped off earlier, marked personal, no return address, just my name written neatly on the front. I knew immediately who it was from. I sat down before opening it. Some letters deserve that respect. Inside was a single page, handwritten. The handwriting was careful, slightly uneven, like it had been written slowly, thoughtfully. I could almost feel the effort behind each word. She wrote that she hoped I was well. She wrote that the days since the funeral had blurred together. Some days felt manageable, others felt impossibly heavy. She wrote that grief came in waves, and she was learning not to fight them. Then she wrote about that day in court. She said that walking into the courtroom the day after burying her husband felt unreal, like she was moving through a world that no longer belonged to her. She said she expected to be scolded, fined, or made to feel worse than she already did. Instead, she wrote, she was treated with kindness. She said something in that letter that I will never forget. She wrote that when I dismissed the case, it wasn't the dismissal that mattered most. It was the fact that someone saw her pain and didn't add to it. She wrote that in a moment when everything felt broken, that kindness gave her permission to stop pretending she was okay. I read that sentence twice. She wrote that after court, she went home and sat in the quiet of her house, the same house she had shared with her husband for decades. And for the first time since he passed, she didn't feel ashamed of how lost she felt. She said she wanted me to know that. At the end of the letter, she wrote something simple. She wrote, "Thank you for letting me be human." I folded the letter slowly and placed it in my desk drawer alongside others I keep private. Letters like that don't belong in files. They belong in memory. I sat there for a long time after that, thinking about how easily that day could have gone differently, how routine could have overridden compassion, how procedure could have overshadowed humanity. I thought about how often people come to court already broken, already overwhelmed, already afraid, and how powerful it can be when the system doesn't make things worse. As I walked out of the courthouse that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps. I paused for a moment, taking it in. After all these years, moments like that still ground me. On the drive home, I turned off the radio and let the quiet fill the car. I thought about my own life, my own marriage, the comfort of knowing someone is there at the end of the day, and how fragile that certainty really is. At home, my wife noticed right away that I was thoughtful. She asked me what was on my mind, and I told her about the letter. I told her about the words that stayed with me. She listened, then said something that felt true in a way only simple things do. She said sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is not making their worst day worse. She was right. In the weeks that followed, I carried that lesson with me into every courtroom session. Every tired face, every shaky voice, every person apologizing for something they couldn't control. I listened more closely. I slowed down when it mattered. One morning, a man stood before me who had clearly not slept. His case was minor, but his exhaustion was obvious. Instead of rushing, I asked him how he was doing. He paused, surprised, then admitted he was caring for a sick parent and barely keeping it together. I handled his case fairly, but I also made sure he left, knowing he wasn't invisible. That's how compassion works. It spreads quietly. I never saw the woman from that case again, and that was as it should be. Court is not a place people should have to return to often, but I think about her from time to time. I wonder how she's doing. I wonder how the house feels now. I wonder how grief has changed shape as time passed. I know one thing for certain. On one of the hardest days of her life, she showed up anyway. And on that day, the law stepped aside and let humanity lead. After more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned that justice is not just about rules. It's about recognizing when someone is already carrying more than enough. It's about understanding that grief has no schedule and no instructions. That woman didn't need a lesson. She didn't need a warning. She needed space. She needed kindness. She needed to be seen. And in that moment, that was justice. So let me ask you this. If you were in my position that day, what would you have done? Would you have followed the letter of the law or listened to the weight of her words? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And here's another question for you. Have you ever had to show up somewhere when your heart was breaking just because life didn't stop when you needed it to? If you have, you're not alone. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that compassion still has a place in this world, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell so you don't miss another story from my courtroom. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who might be carrying grief quietly, wondering if anyone sees them. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another story that will remind you why character matters more than procedure, and why justice, at its best, begins with empathy. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for over 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all human before we're anything else, rich or poor, strong or broken. And when someone stands before the law in pain, the least we can do is meet them with compassion. Thank you for listening to this story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.